Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, audiences from wherever you are. Welcome to ZICO Law's weekly Wednesday webinar. This is our 10th edition. We started out the first one at the end of March. Very proud to bring to you legal topics, business topics, and issues at this difficult time, unprecedented time that we're living through. Today, specifically, it is my pleasure to introduce and bring three business leaders. We have conversations with a CEO, a CFO, and a GC today. And they come from the three different industries, which are, I think, quite severely impacted by COVID-19. Before I get into that, maybe some housekeeping rules. We do have a Q&A. If you're familiar with Teams, there's a bar there. There's a Q&A feature on the right. You can click that and type in your questions. We'll try to answer them during this webinar. If not, please leave your contact details so that then we can follow up with the responses. This should last about 60 minutes. I plan to go with the first half on what's impacting their businesses now. And then on the second half of the webinar, we're going to talk about the future, lessons learned, what's new normal for them in the industry and their businesses. So I thank you again for participating. And my name is Hanim Hamza. I'm the Regional Managing Partner of ZICO Law. We are a law firm network, the first and only one that's present in all 10 countries in ASEAN, with 18 offices, 300 lawyers across the region. Okay, let's move on. The first, I think it's since, ladies first, I will bring in Ibu Sinta Sirait to talk to us about education, the impact of the COVID-19 on the education industry. Sinta is a CFO with Jakarta Intercultural School, JIS. You should be familiar with JIS. It's established in 1951 and is one of the largest international schools in the world, according to H2L2 Architecture Digest. It has, 250 plus classrooms, 2,354 enrollment year. So it's a huge operation, $100 million operation, and Sinta sits there running their finance amongst other things. Sinta herself has an MBA from Denver, University of Colorado, and a graduate of the MIT Sloan School Program for Leadership. And she's a people person. Before this role that she has with JIS, she was also dealing with a lot of kind of HR, employment issues, and with government when she was at PD Freeport. So I'll stop there and kind of Sinta, welcome to the webinar. How's things been with you? I know you're in Jakarta there, and JIS.
Good morning, Hanim. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of the experience from the educational sector. Jakarta is quiet, but not quite quiet. I think people are getting ready to have a new era of post-COVID. So I guess I'll just maybe briefly talk a little bit about JIS, even though I hope today I'm not just talking on behalf of JIS, but also a lot of alike schools in the region. So JIS is EY2K, so pre-K to 12, 2,300 students, as Hanim has mentioned. We are a member of EARCOS, the East Regional Council of Schools, which is basically like the organization that look after similar international schools in the East Asia region. We have about 200 members, more than 100,000 students, pre-K to 12, and the language of instruction is English. Now, I think perhaps if I can just explain a little bit about the difference between nonprofit and for-profit schools. I mean, JIS is one of the nonprofit schools. Nonprofit means that basically you spend everything that you make. If you're lucky, you have maybe you target 2 to 3% of your school fee into the surplus to your reserve fund. Usually, rule of thumb, 25% of your annual budget should be reflected in your reserve fund. Good schools also have endowment fund. Now, on the other side of the pendulum, the for-profit schools are lucky enough to have investors. Investors meaning usually in the board of trustee, you have, in addition to parents, you also have the investors, the owners of the school. So during this difficult time, maybe, I'm just guessing, for-profit schools will have a little bit more strategic allocation of fund to help the situation during the preparation of the reopening of the school, while the non-profit schools, they basically have to be really vigilant about the cash flow management and how to actually, slowly adjust the cost structure to the new reality. What has happened since February, I think end of February, mid-March, a lot of things happening. More than 70%, I think, of the students, the population of 1.2 billion around the world, more than 153 countries, they cannot physically go to school. So all the learning and delivery of teaching is done through online home learning. Now, international schools like JIS is lucky enough to have one-to-one policy. So we actually have one laptop for one student, grade 5 and above, and iPad for the grade 4 and lower. But not all schools are as lucky. So for example, in Jakarta, in Indonesia, I know that the Ministry of Education actually has regular TV shows in the national TV and the radio stations for certain subjects to be delivered through TV station. And again, the participation of parents is so key, because without parent support, nobody can really control how discipline and how the control mechanism is in place. So for JIS, what happened is even before the closure of the school, we basically prepare everything, right? So we over-communicate with parents. We have, parents forum. We maybe post weekly newsletter and so many different way to communicate, because it's so important to get the participation of all stakeholders, the teachers, students, and parents. Teachers are being trained like an emergency training, right, for using different platforms. So we have asynchronous and synchronous platform, whether it's Google Classroom, Google Meets, Hangouts. We have the Seesaw. It's similar like a blog-like kind of platform that you can actually, it's like a mini Sesame Street. So you actually record the lesson, post it in Seesaw, and student can watch and rewatch, etc. So there's a lot of activities even before the school closure. Now the first month, maybe 5 weeks during the online learning, everybody is still okay, the interest is still high, etc. But then after that, you can see concentration is lower, discipline is lower, parents are overwhelmed. There's a number of complaints from parents, etc. So it's a learning process, and I think the key is regular communication, regular assessment and evaluation. You compare yourself. There's no best practices. Nobody has been in this situation ever, I don't think. So we compare notes with similar schools in the region, and we learn from our mistakes and good things. I mean, opportunities, I hate to only talk about challenges, but opportunities, there's so many. You can see that a number of students who have been quiet, who have been shy, actually prevail. So they have more time to prepare. They can actually, prepare questions before class starts. They can go back to their lessons and watch the video. And actually, some parents prefer to have an online approach. For the business model point of view, I think a number of parents think that, hey, how come universities have online and face-to-face on-campus version with less cost? So why don't you pre-K to 12 schools also adjust accordingly? And it's not as simple as flipping your hand like that. It takes time. It takes adjustment. And actually, the reopening school, as I mentioned to Handim earlier, is basically costing a lot of money to the school, because you have to prepare your thermal scanner, your hand washing station, and you have to reduce the capacity of your students in the bus, and the classroom have to have the social distancing. So there's a number of investment that you have to be willing to do before the school starts. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Cinta, for bringing. You brought up some very important themes there. I think on finances, how difficult it is for those who don't have reserves. Maybe you can explain a little bit. How have you been dealing with? Have you been dealing with variation of contracts? You know, that kind of like parents wanting refunds and things like that. How have you been dealing with that, and how do you decide what to pay and what not to? I'll stop there. And the second one I'm going to ask you about is in terms of developmental hazard. I think you said, you know, it is true. A lot of people out of school, you know, and it's more like for the rich that has Wi-Fi or resources, you can learn from home. And I'm surprised and glad to hear about the radio tuning. I think that's really great by the government. But let's hear about this since as a CFO point of view in terms of how do we deal with this mismatch, financial, yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. I think the cost structure of a nonprofit school traditionally is about 60 to 80% of personnel, because again, we deliver the service in education, and the key is the quality of teachers, right? So you only have that 20%, 30 to maybe 20% to 30% of the operational cost that you can actually address. And we have done that. We basically renegotiate all the contracts with our vendors, especially long-term vendors, asking for no increase. We look at some of the non-essential areas that we can reduce. So I think overall reduction is about 15 to 20%. But that's not sufficient because the expected downturn in enrollment is from 20 up to 50%. I mean, some schools, I know that in KL and in Bangkok, also looking at maybe 50% of reduction of parents, because parents are still in the wait and see kind of situation. Again, companies are reducing their package for expatriates. Maybe if you're lucky, you still have jobs, right? Embassies are not sending back their officers back in the assigned country. So there's a number of uncertainty in a way. So again, cash flow management is so important. Developmental hazard, I think UNESCO has done a number of studies on the potential of this hazard, but you also have to see that a number of organizations out there like Khan University Academy and others actually provide online learning for free. Now, again, it all depends back to the government, whether they can provide the infrastructure and the willingness to allocate funds to those remote areas. So at least it can be a group setting, collaborative online setting for learning. So it's doable, but it's not easy, and it needs a commitment from the government.
Thanks. I think I'm gonna come back to you later on future and what you're seeing. How can this work with all these challenges that's coming from this COVID? We now move on to automotive industry, and I am delighted that today we have General Counsel Daniel Kim for APAC for Continental. Continental. Many of you may think Continental and you think tires, you know, but actually it's a mobility-focused listed technology company, and he has 4.4 billion in sales, started in Germany and listed in Germany in many different bourses there. And you know, it's a global top 3 for electronic brake systems. It's huge technological advancements and research on automotive AVs, you know, automotive vehicles. Lots of new technology that's been doing by Continental, not just on the tires. And Daniel himself, I've known him since when he was GC at Caltex, Chevron, many years ago. We worked together on a deal in Indonesia. And since then, I've seen his career growth, grown from one company to now to Continental, dealing with Asia Pacific. So I'm really happy to have Daniel agree to talk to us a little bit on what's happening in his sector. And Daniel, over to you, and we can tell us what's going on with Continental and generally in automotive.
Yes, hello, Hanim and everyone. It is certainly a pleasure to be here, to be able to share my perspectives and experience from the automotive side of it. Yeah, so, you know, we are living in very interesting times right now, and certainly not just interesting, but very challenging for many of our players and companies in the market and in different industries. And automotive industry has been going through, especially going through a very tough time in the last year or so. Even before pandemic hit the industry, already the industry was going through quite a big scale of transformation because of the shift from a conventional automotive business model to more of a future kind of oriented or future driven business model. So companies were had a very challenging task to adjust to the new demands from the market, both in terms of technology and also in terms of the regulatory environment and everything else. So just coming into pandemic, it only exacerbated the situation for all of us. Already the challenge was huge, but now we really have to do the immediate firefighting, so to speak, to really, to make it through this very challenging economic situation. So just to give you a bit of a overview of what's been happening due to the pandemic to our company, we have manufacturing plants all over the world in different continents, Asia, Europe, and Americas. Definitely when first coronavirus was emerged in China, of course, our Chinese manufacturing plants, they were shut down. And that had a huge impact on our manufacturing side in APAC, because China is actually in not only the epicenter for virus, but also the epicenter for a lot of our, automotive parts and components. So when they are down, then it definitely has a ripple effect to the rest of the world. So that was a huge impact for our global business. And then the epicenter moved from China, as you know, to Europe. And then our European manufacturing plants were hit very hard. And then thankfully, China was slowly coming back at the time. So I'm talking like April timeframe. So our European plants were struggling very hard at the time. Europe, as a manufacturing hub, it is already struggling. So even without this pandemic, we were talking about a lot of kind of manufacturing restructuring before, but then now, the plants are down, and due to the different regulatory environments and also labor law regimes, in some of our European countries, we had to shorten the work hours of our employees, and that's how they do it. Instead of laying them off, actually we still keep them, but actually we reduce the working hours for our plant workers, for example. So that is actually what we did in Europe, and that is still going on primarily in Germany. And then, moving from Europe to Americas, as you know, now I think Americas is the region that is hardest hit. And despite the widespread virus issue in the U.S., U.S. is trying to come back. I mean, as you know, and they're still trying to open their businesses. They're still trying to open manufacturing plants. But there, the problem is Mexico, because Mexico is not keeping pace with the U.S. I think Mexico is more taking more strict measures to respond to the pandemic. So a lot of the plants are on the lockdown or shutdown mode, at least until 1st of June. So even though U.S. plants want to ramp up, but because Mexico plants are still down, they cannot get the necessary parts and components from Mexico. So yeah, I mean, it is actually still not very normal in the U.S. So that is kind of the impact in general, in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you for that, Daniel. I think you brought up a very good point on supply chains. I think when you say when China goes down, and then after that, I think about 70-80% I read of automotive manufacturing is in China, and how that kind of pretty much crippled the whole automotive industry. We cannot get things across, which later will, I think, likely lead to peat and logistics and transport. But in terms of supply chains, what's your view? Is it globalization, and should things be just built in the country where they are sold rather than, I want to hear your view on that.
Yeah, I think until this whole pandemic happened, I think most people were supportive of the idea that supply chains has to be global, and we have to find suppliers that can deliver the right products at the right time. So sort of a just-in-time kind of concept. So the location did not really matter, because nowadays international trade environment is so efficient, right? So everyone was kind of banking on that concept. But this whole pandemic kind of changed, people's perception in that regard. I wouldn't say to a large extent, but I think still people, I think, do believe that international trade is necessary, so it needs to come back. However, because this pandemic thing has highlighted this risk that a lot of people were not aware of, now the strategy is not only international trade is important, not only is it important to identify suppliers, no matter what the location is, suppliers who are reliable, but also maybe as a backup, you need a backup plan, or you need backup supply sources close to where you are in the plant. So actually, that's what a lot of automotive companies in Asia are doing. Japanese companies and Korean automotive makers, they actually want their suppliers to be physically near where they are. And in the past, that was seen as sort of old school, but I think now, I think it is gaining traction again because of what happened here. Just to give you a bit more information, before this pandemic, there were some earthquakes that happened in Japan, for example, back in 2011 and 2016. And because of one or two Japanese suppliers being heavily affected by earthquake, there was a force majeure event. And at that time, the widespread thinking was, wow, we should avoid this kind of situation in the future. Therefore, we should not stick to like one supplier in one country, but we should diversify suppliers across different countries, right? But now the thinking is not only do we have to do that, but we actually should have a backup supplier close to where we are.
Yeah, and those kind of, decisions are not like you can make like that, right? Because you're talking about building plans and, and skilling people and things like that. So that's another. As a GC, what are the kind of legal issues that you've seen come through from COVID-19 that you've been having to deal with in the last 2 months or so while working from home?
Well, the first and foremost is the force majeure. Force majeure is a big topic for lawyers. And as I said, back in 2016, we had to deal with a force majeure topic with our customers globally. And now, of course, as soon as this pandemic started happening, the first thing that we did was to send out force majeure letters to our customers, right? So there's a lot of debate about what force majeure is, whether it is covered by the contract that you have, and also there are certain conditions to be met in order for force majeure claim to be successful, right? So did you do the things that you need to do, right, to be able to rely on that defense? And sometimes, unfortunately, some of those conditions may not be met. So that gives the customers a right to still claim damages. But yeah, force majeure is a big thing. Another thing is it's not a legal issue, but it's more of a debt collection issue. So there are a lot of receivables that we have with our big customers, and many of our big customers came to us and said, can we delay payment, or can you give us like years of deferment? And so this is a very thorny issue that we have with our customers right now. Because we are fortunately one of the biggest tier 1 suppliers, we do have a bargaining power to kind of push back, but I can see a lot of other smaller suppliers actually having to sort of concede to the demands of big customers.
Thank you. Thanks, Nana. It's always very not easy when you have to squeeze others in order to kind of survive. Let's move, talking about survival, I'm not going to move to automotive, to aviation logistics. This morning on Channel News Asia, there was a big segment on Air Asia, how difficult the industry, and I welcome Pete to provide some of his insights. Virgin is filing for bankruptcy, Thai Airways. I think people are down. I know he's not in the aviation per se, but his business Teleport, which is 100% subsidiary of Air Asia Berhad, started as a startup 2 years ago, 50 million to now 200 million. He's really quite a maverick CEO, and I'm keen to hear his challenges right now. What's happening with his? Arguably, logistics things have done well because of the saving the high street, so to speak. But then again, because his business, I think, is reliant on Teleport, relies a lot on the Air Asia fleet and also others I know. But being grounded with all the borders locked, yeah, I'm sure it's been quite challenging. Pete, welcome and share with us.
Thanks, Anim, and obviously thanks to the other participants for having me. I was just thinking about the best way to respond to kind of some of the topics that were brought up, and I'm a little tongue-in-cheek about some of it, because I think Ibu Sinta was talking about schools that have non-profit and profit type, shall we say, designations. I think in the aviation space, we also have non-profit and profit airlines. That is, any non-profit airline never has to make any money. And then, in a downturn like today, they can access money at will, often from governments. And then we have, profit-seeking airlines like ourselves that have to live and die by our own balance sheet. So I think that was the first thing that I was trying to draw parallels. So just trying to segue nicely into I think what we've experienced. I think the second thing is also when Daniel was talking about debt collection, I was just trying to triple check whether we owed Continental any money. So Daniel, I apologize in advance if we do. We can work something out. But I think in all seriousness, it is, everyone said unprecedented many, many times, but it's a scary time because, in the Air Asia group business, I'll just talk about the airline maybe for a second before I, segue into logistics. But the airline business basically went to zero in terms of zero revenue over a course of maybe 2 weeks, right? So imagine if you're a, multi-billion-dollar company and your source of revenue essentially goes to zero in 2 weeks. It's not very fun. And then you see 280 plus of your fleet kind of sitting on the ground with people taking pictures of them at will. And then the third thing is you look at 24,000 staff and you realize, goodness me, if I have no strategy to get out of this, then we're talking about 24,000 people and their families and the wider kind of impact of the industry going down as a result of that being a scary thing to consider. And I think on top of that, even more, then you start to see your peer group start to kind of fall one by one. And Hanim, you mentioned, Virgin, obviously a high-profile name, but we really talk about guys like Lufthansa, which are sitting on 10 billion euros of planes, could not even raise money on those planes, and had to go hat in hand to the government to ask for money in exchange for equity. You look at the U.S. and all the guys that were basically begging the Treasury for a bailout, which they got, which only really lasted until September, to which they then would make no promises on jobs. Then you look at guys like LATAM, who've just filed yesterday. That's a huge airline in South America, and you think, man, that's getting kind of closer and closer to a global impact. And then you look at Norwegian, that has had to basically is a low-cost carrier like AirAsia X, and has basically become a kind of funded by creditors, basic lessors really. And then you look at Thai Airways, which is very close to home, and close to home for me because I'm Thai. And you look at them going through bankruptcy, and you think this is something that is systemic. And it only really hits you, I think, when you really start to see tangible examples of that come through. Now, I think in this COVID period, which I would say has been the last 2 months and a little bit, I think we've been so focused, insularly on kind of, keeping the business afloat as a whole. And I think one thing that reflects from kind of what's happened in COVID is I don't think it's sufficiently shifted, anything in terms of how businesses behave, but I think it's accelerated, maybe to some degree how consumers behave and how businesses are needing to respond to that. And so I think it hasn't structurally changed anything yet, I would say, and I would, be a sage to say it won't, but I would say that, from what we've seen, it hasn't fundamentally shifted anything beneath the surface. It's just exposed what's beneath the surface. So you talk about supply chains, just in time. I mean, it works well in good times, but then you realize how brittle it is in an event like this, or you realize how brittle it is when you don't have a backup, right? So I think what we've seen in the aviation space when everything has kind of gone to zero is, who's able to respond quickly? Who's agile enough to have a game plan, even if there isn't anything on paper, but you just got to move with what's happening on a day-to-day basis. Who executes and who's close to their teams and their staff and the culture in terms of, okay, so, how are we going to go through this as a shared sacrifice versus let's default to the whole, let's cut people's jobs, let's lay people off, let's shut down. So I think it reflects, culture a lot in terms of kind of how the organization is structured and frankly, what's the inherent culture in the company. And I think as AirAsia, I think, one thing that we always talk about, and, maybe it shows up in times like this is, we're trying to be agile and resilient, right? We're not trying to be like everybody else where we assume that, there's a fallback plan. There really isn't. So everything that has happened in COVID has been as a result of doing something ourselves, right? I mean, we literally are kind of painting the roadmap as we go day by day. So I would say that's the broad strokes on the airline. I'm sure you want to ask me more specific questions about specific things, and I'm happy to answer them. But I think maybe just shifting to the logistics business, again, very scary because, I rely heavily on the fleet of AirAsia to build a business, and the business we were building, actually we reached, 480 million ringgit last year. So we did get a little bit above 200. We got 480, and this year we had a plan to double that, but that's obviously being shelved, and I would likely put that plan in a museum somewhere at some point. But what we realized is, a lot of that 480 was also, again, built on foundations that are shaky, right? And things that you can't really factor in completely. But what we did instead was we shifted very quickly. I would say even one day before what they call the movement control order in Malaysia, which is where I'm based, which is basically kind of just, kind of a severe shutdown of the country. We started flying cargo on passenger planes, so entirely, filling up the plane with cargo. And we were the first in Malaysia to do it, and certainly one of the first in Southeast Asia to do it. So, and we literally timed it one day before MCO. I mean, it wasn't for any great insight, but it was just, we were kind of trying to be ahead of the curve anyway, and just so happened that, we could execute that rather quick. Our next biggest competitor in Malaysia, and I won't say the name, but I would say they fall into the non-profit category, started 4 weeks later. But, after that, I think, the playing field is even. So it's not that you start first and you have a first mover advantage and you can sustain that. But I would say it's also kind of, things change so fast. And so the next evolution was that we could then load cargo where the passengers used to sit. And that sounds easier said than done. It sounds very intuitive, but actually, as Daniel said, it's not you snap your fingers and these things happen. I mean, we're 9 airlines in 9 different, basically jurisdictions. And to get that approved one by one, with different regulators having different interpretations, is extremely complex. And then, internally you want to manage safety and security. And also, frankly, everyone's working from home. So that dynamic of speed and kind of this desire to get things done may not be, equally spread out over the organization. You face these kind of structural issues. So now you see everybody doing it. Now you see people, I'm sure you've seen pictures of people taking their seats out and putting cargo in instead and flying all sorts of different ways to kind of stay afloat. And so we did that, and we ended the quarter, so the first quarter, revenue up year on year, 36%. So we were up, as you rightly said. Logistics is I think a benefactor to some degree of what's happened. And we basically were up because we pivoted to 2 things. One is we publicly said that we were going to help the healthcare and the frontliners by essentially dedicating most of our capacity to anyone that came in saying they needed help to move masks, PPE, even hospital beds, test kits, etc. Because we realized that was the quickest and fastest way to connect particularly as the pandemic kept moving from country to country, right? And really air freight is really the best way to do it, in our view, fastest as well. So we did that. We publicly said that, and obviously a little bit self-serving in the sense that, obviously we want to keep our planes flying, but at the same time, we realized that we were sitting on the right infrastructure, and we didn't want to send the wrong message that, we were going to be picky. We said we were going to try and be helpful, and then hopefully out of being helpful, we could kind of also sustain our business. The second thing is obviously, as you mentioned, e-commerce, and we shifted really fast to e-commerce because we realized that, as people really couldn't ship between cross borders, which is really the core of our business, we realized that everybody wanted stuff kind of within their city or within, their township or across the road, etc. So we actually moved into food delivery from parcel delivery, shall we say, 10 days into kind of MCO or lockdown, which, honestly is a testament to having the right foundations, right? There's no way, it's not I'm great. It's more like the foundations were being built over the last, shall we say, 12 to 18 months. So to change and to pivot and to be agile is a little easier when you're sitting on the right tech or the right kind of mindset or people, etc. So those are some of the things we did. We also launched a campaign called SOS, or Save Our Shops, where we said, okay, we figure that most small businesses really only have about 15 to 25 days of cash flow. We're a little more lucky. So why don't we lend what we have in terms of, at the very minimum, visibility and kind of a little bit of exposure to some of these guys, just to see whether we could have a helping hand. So I think we had 4,500 people sign up in a week, and some of these guys had never sold online before, so it was literally helping them one by one how to take a picture, kind of how to make sure that we can upload their items onto an e-commerce site that we own, how to kind of help them market their product, and then how to help them kind of get their story out, kind of, hey, you're a person at the end of the day, you have a story behind everything you do, and how do we put that at the forefront of the message as opposed to please buy their stuff, right? And so I think we were trying to be a little different in that sense. So that's kind of in a roundabout way, I guess, some of the things we've done. Happy to dive deeper in any of it, but yeah, I mean, it's been a tough time, and I don't think we've seen the end of it personally, and honestly, no one really knows what the outcomes are. So the only thing we can really do is kind of evolve day by day.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Daniel and then come back to you after that. But before I go to Daniel, just to ask you on, do you then see a consolidation of operators? Is now the time then? Because, one of the things that we have chatted in the UK, where you have more mergers, whereas in Asia, surely people can work more together, more consolidation.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I think it's logical that, you have less players in the market, there's a shakeout, things recombine and start again, and you're sitting on some resources that other people may want. But I kind of have a counter view to that, which is I think there are going to be a lot of new airlines starting up because the barriers to entry are now basically zeroized again to some degree. And you can see the problem with consolidation is it doesn't make the problems go away, right? There is a reason why many of them are going bankrupt today, is because they're sitting on shaky foundations. I mean, you look at some airlines are burning in one day the amount of capital we burn in 1 month, right? And so, that doesn't go away just by consolidation, and particularly when, business is uncertain as to when it's going to come back. So is bigger always better at this time? Not convinced. I mean, I think you may see business models of, shall we say, online-only airlines in some way, where literally you don't even have to experience anything physical other than just make your way to the plane in some way. I think that's possible. I think it's possible that airlines with slightly different business models start up again, maybe in the premium sector, as they start to cream off the top and then work their way down, because you can't sit in a middle seat at the moment for many places, and so people got to think about efficiency differently in the space, and maybe in some ways the airline industry just shrinks, and that's unfortunate because we take for granted how easy travel is. And I haven't been home to Bangkok in 4.5 months. And before I used to be able to sit on 15 flights a day and take my pick, right? And so now it's literally zero, and plus quarantine, etc. So I think the space is going to shrink a little bit, and let's see what that really evolves. Maybe the manufacturers come up with a new fleet type accelerated from COVID that lends itself to different business models. So I don't think consolidation will be the only thing we see, though I expect there to be some, but I don't think it solves every problem.
Which means, I think, when you talk about that, then price increase, I think one of the questions from our, but before I go that, let me just get back to, thank you, Pete, to Daniel on automotive, going on, kind of more niche products. How about, tell us a little bit about what your thoughts on automotive and on AVs, in terms of driverless cars, and what the trends there coming out from COVID.
Yes, as I already mentioned, I think even before this COVID came in, our automotive industry was going through a major transformation. So the two big themes were electrification. So we're transitioning from kind of a fuel injection systems to more of a sort of an electric vehicle kind of a system, and that was one transformation that we were going through. And the other transformation was, of course, developing technologies to make our vehicles more autonomous or automated. And that was sort of the big wave that we were riding already. However, when the pandemic hit, that was a sort of a major disruption to that flow, to that wave. And now people are trying to figure out exactly what should be the priorities for us, in the next 2-3 years, for example. The general perception is autonomous driving technologies is more of a longer term project. So it is not something that is demanded by our customers like, today or tomorrow or next year, but it is something that we have to work with automakers, on a sort of a more medium to longer term thing to figure out exactly, what kind of autonomous driving vehicles can work for the market and for people, right? And there are a lot of different stakeholders involved. As you know, regulatory bodies is one of them. So it is not an easy topic, and it was going to take a lot of time anyway. But I guess my guess is this pandemic might actually delay the process, delay the transition to AI or AV kind of concept, because now we have to do immediate firefighting just to survive in this very challenging market. And development of new technologies requires a lot of investment and requires a lot of money, right? So already even big automotive suppliers were struggling to kind of figure out exactly how much we should spend on our future, as opposed to kind of making money now, right? I think that was always a big question. However, yeah, I mean, long story short, I do think that AV development may be slightly delayed due to the current COVID situation. And electrification will probably be prioritized more because of the new regulation that came in Europe, 2020, new emission standards, which is very actually demanding and aggressive for automakers. So as soon as the COVID thing ends, people will try to sort of make that rapid shift to electric vehicles, so as to meet the new regulations around the world. And then AV topic will probably gain traction. So I think it will happen sort of in a phased manner. So now immediate firefighting, and then electrification and AV, if I have to order them. Yeah.
Thanks. I think one of the discussions that's been going on is how we want to see the environmental transition, discussions to continue despite COVID, or even responsible capitalism. I think, as Pete mentioned, it's not that easy. We can't just repurpose a car to make it automotive drive itself. Unlike a plane, maybe take out the seats and put, then you have become social enterprises. It's great. Again, I think different ways of how this COVID has brought us to lead businesses to think differently. On another thing on ride hailing, I think one thing that Uber said, they have also cut jobs. That was one of the trends the last couple of years. But now, because of social distancing, people may prefer to have their own cars back again rather than be in a smelly, dirty, non-hygienic car. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So what is interesting is Americans and Europeans, especially Germans, have a slightly different culture and different mindset. I do see Germans, they kind of tend to cherish old ways of doing things more. Americans are always very innovative. They wanna create something that's gonna give us more comfort, more convenience, and more efficiency. And here, because I work in a German company, I think there are people in the company that are cautiously optimistic that people's preference for personal mobility may actually come back as a result of COVID. So it's kind of weighing up efficiency versus hygiene or health. Like, what is going to be more important to you? I think a lot of people realize that now having their own car actually is a good thing. Now they can, even under lockdown situation, they can go shopping, they can go wherever they want. Whereas other people, who have to rely on Grab services, they actually may not want to leave their house, too keenly. So I think that is actually a slight transition, slight sort of a change that I see happening in the market. Yes, ride hailing, but I do talk to other people and they say, yeah, but it is still better than mass transportation. I don't want to take MRT, subway. I don't want to take the bus. I would rather actually be in a Grab car, hopefully driven by a machine, not person. So I think that kind of a mindset also may fuel the acceleration of development and introduction of in the future autonomous driven Grab ride-hailing services.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. I think on one hand, I'm going to go to Pete to tell us about what he thinks about blockchain development, because on one hand, you say AV might take time. They might be slow in terms of AV for regular cars, but maybe not for ride hailing. But in terms of logistics and blockchain and not dealing with having to bring things across with planes, thoughts, Pete, on that?
Yeah. So thanks, Anim, for the question. I think it's a tough one because it's not really the technology itself, obviously, that is, kind of the reason it's adopted or not adopted. I think a lot of it is behavior, right? So even the ride-hailing example is something that may be in vogue for a moment, and then suddenly now people are pulling back. So it's not really a given that something happens as a result of just introducing technology into someone's life, right? I think the same thing is with blockchain, that because we introduced something built on blockchain where basically anybody could instantly book our planes or our capacity through blockchain. So we called it Freight Chain, and I think we launched it a few weeks ago. And what we realized is that the industry that we operate in, which is kind of, cargo and supply chain, is still to some degree very human-driven, human relationship orientated. Still people kind of talking to people to gain comfort in doing things and making things happen. And so what we found during the peak, I would say, of COVID is that breaks quickly because people really, access becomes so scarce, and then people are really jockeying with each other, whether calling different people they know or referring people. And so that process is very manual and, shall we say, very inefficient. And so actually a lot of things that can be done to actually help, for example, get frontliners access to PPE instead of having, those things that we see on Twitter, like bin bags and things like that happen, actually can be solved if, as an industry, we would be willing to change the way we operate. But unfortunately, it's so ingrained that, people want to, kind of gain comfort into, okay, you represent AirAsia, okay, so I can trust you, or, okay, does this price, kind of stick around for long enough for me to pay you? And all these kind of things, I think, are kind of very deep kind of human behaviors when we are in the business realm that is not going to change so quickly. I think the analogous examples is in law and in telemedicine and so on as well, where I think the industries are trying to figure out how to permanently shift people's, shall we say, comfort towards attempting to kind of do things differently. And blockchain is no different. You can have blockchain technology, which is supposed to give you visibility across the supply chain, instant confirmation with smart contracts, price transparency, as basically there's no intermediary party kind of managing as a central pool kind of price and capacity, right? Which are scarce resources. But even then, it's not enough if the participants don't, interact with it and don't, shall we say, change their behaviors in terms of being willing to kind of allow and trust kind of other things as opposed to their own relationships, their own contracts, their own, shall we say, eyes and ears to make things happen. So we launched blockchain. We think it represents, maybe we're slightly ahead in terms of trying to push an agenda, but again, it's kind of trying to anticipate what's to come. And my hope is that, if there's one thing that's come out good in this pandemic, it's that we break down old ways of doing things, legacy structures that may not always work well for people as a whole, and as a result, kind of rebuild that. So that's our hope for blockchain. I think you asked me a question earlier, certainly a written question about flying and fear of flying. I think that's again another human behavior question where it's not for lack of safety protocols, kind of things in place that, as an airline operator, or frankly, even airports and other stakeholders can put in place. It's really, are people comfortable to kind of use your product again? And so that's something that I think is the biggest open-ended question for ride hailers, for guys, in the airline space, and for many others in the spaces. When will people be comfortable again to trust and to kind of be willing to go again? And honestly, I have no idea, but I was walking around the mall the other day with a mask, and I felt the urge to buy something because I'd been locked down for 60 days, and I realized, well, I guess on the other hand, we all have these urges to travel and to experience, to buy things, and that doesn't go away. So I'm optimistic that things will, to some degree, fall back to something that we'd seen before, not sort of completely kind of new and uncharted. So positively optimistic about kind of the use of technology to augment, maybe what was done before and can be done better. And then the second point is, soon enough, hopefully consumers also adopt and adapt to the new norm.
Would you say then, as a CEO, that in the future for teleport is to have more cargo planes and not to rely on, say, passenger tourism planes? I know you say the urges people will still want to travel, whatever, but what would you say in terms of your strategy moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it strikes at the heart of, I think, what we debate all the time. So I'll give you some numbers just to put context. If I was to convert my passenger plane to a cargo-only equivalent, that could be in the order of magnitude of 15 to 20 million US dollars, which could be the price of a plane in the future with the way things are going. So it's not, the switching cost is high. The second thing is, if consumers come back and our network comes back online, which if you look in China, for example, their domestic capacity has come back 75% pre-COVID. So, that's bounced back in the order of magnitude of 3 or 4 months. Then you would assume that, the ability to load cargo alongside passengers is the most efficient way to still do things, though there might be some tweaks here and there. So it's balancing those two factors up, switching costs versus kind of, okay, what do we anticipate, the core business to look like? But I think the third thing is also, okay, well, how do we make sure we don't rely on cargo as our default, revenue stream? And I think that's one good thing. I think also that, the team has been pushed to consider, whereas we may have assumed that we don't want to go into certain spheres or certain markets because we just assume we're not going to win, or we don't have the capacity to do. But I think when we started doing food delivery, groceries delivery, and we started doing kind of funky other esoteric ways of delivering things on demand, we realized that actually we could be profitable, grow the business, and still compete against guys that have been in the space for 7 to 8 years. So it wasn't a given that it's done and everything's sewn up and stitched up. So if there's one thing that COVID has been, it's been a leveler, right? It's been a leveler for everyone again to say, okay, well, if everyone has to start again, unfortunately, as scary as it sounds, who's going to rock and roll, right? So I think, that gives me some comfort that, we're still playing and music is still going and we're still trying to keep dancing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Pete. I want to go back to Cinta before we end at the hour. I think we've still got a couple of minutes on the future for education. And, and when you talk about how to change and things like that with money put in, it's very difficult. Share with us some of your thoughts on education in the future, Cinta.
Well, I like the way Pete actually said it. It's like, who will be rock and rolling, right, after this COVID? There's no turning back, definitely. I mean, schools will have to adopt and consider online courses, especially for the higher grades. It's a little bit more difficult for lower grades because that playground interaction, what they call it, is so crucial. And I don't think at this moment there's anything to replace that experience. However, for higher grades, especially high school, grade 9 to 12, there's so many opportunities out there. So you can, of course, schools have to look at their strategic intent again and understand that if you want to go work together with the service providers or the content providers. I mean, I can mention a number of organizations who actually are the content provider. The Global Online Academy, for example, it's a little bit, it's asynchronous type of provider. They provide credits, so any subjects that goes to credits towards credit per course is very cheap, 750. You want to go to the higher end, the Stanford Online High School, which is basically a full-time 4 courses type of package, can be $25,000, half of the school fee that usually international school charges. Or you can go to Coursera, right? Coursera is basically a platform, it's a destination that customers go to and look for courses. But the actual development of the content is actually by the partners. So, for example, University of Michigan, they actually have 200 courses with Coursera and 2 degrees that they actually publish through Coursera, which is in public health and science. So I think the key is either you choose to go and build that partnership and be part of the ecosystem with the existing providers in the market, and then you choose whether you want to go premium or you want to have the lower end, which is synchronous, which is face-to-face at the same time, zone, and then learn as a class, or the asynchronous, which is basically more personalized learning. Or you want to invest in technology, as I think Pete and Daniel have mentioned as well in earlier, that your commitment has to be tailored towards innovation and technology. So, for example, GIST chose the second one. So we want to be able to use our icon, our reputation, and our reputation all these years being one of the best international schools. We need to look at 4 different items, right? Whether we have the catalog of available courses, online courses, do we have the capacity and resources, which is basically you have to build a centralized faculty online teaching kind of scheduling resources, which is different with the face-to-face. So you do have to invest in human resources, personnel, and their capability of actually delivering online courses. The third is technology, where I think one of the questions I received just now is, what about bandwidth? What about webcams? Do you actually have to, schools who actually have that capability, unfortunately, will prevail compared to those who don't. What about your governance? Sometimes in schools, they have the board of trustees that can be so rigid, or you have the board of trustees that have to be flexible and adopting quickly enough. So I think the key is also how fast can you adopt, and you can contractual commitments, etc. So 2 things that I think everybody will have to adjust themselves in the educational world is, as a teacher, as a faculty, you have to upskill your competency. You have to learn how to deliver subjects online and using 2 different methodology, right? As a school, you have to adapt, you have to review your cost structure, you have to look at the opportunities to invest in certain areas, which is the innovation and technology, and you have to have commitment to build that resources. Again, it doesn't happen in 1 year, but the sooner you react, the better the result is. And the professional development for teachers is something so important for school to adopt, because then the quality of the teachers are key to your success. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Where would you say one goes about getting this, kind of trained teachers, trained parents have to deal with, online, and trained teachers to do online, and where to find online curriculum? Because this seems to have kind of leapfrogged too quickly. There's no provider that's supplying. Where do you go about to find?
Actually, in the university level, there's so many online courses already, right? The University of Massachusetts, for example, they have the online courses already. Again, I mentioned that even the free ones, the Khan Academy. So they also provide, kind of teaching packages for teachers. again, it all depends on the how, the pedagogy. It's not the substance of the teaching itself. It's the how. And I think I can see already there's a number of investors who, even in Indonesia, I think there's like 3 different online courses already in Indonesia. And I think they will actually also develop some kind of training courses for teachers that, again, it will sell.
Okay, thank you. We are right at the hour. Just very quickly, I just want to do a fire round, 1 question to each of you in terms of a hindsight. Now, looking at what we've gone through with your business and the industry, just a 1-liner or 2-liner at the max, what would you have done differently? Hindsight question, going to Pete first, and then Daniel and then Sinta.
What would I have done differently? Was that the question? Nothing.
Okay, all right. And then Daniel.
Well, yeah, become more technology friendly. I think now we rely on technology so much that I wish I had learned a lot of people. Thanks.
Not even to invest in Zoom, huh, Pete? Okay, all right, Sinta?
I have to agree with Daniel. I think investment in the technology and the competency of the teachers to actually have that flexibility to shift, because it's impossible for teachers to have both face-to-face and online at the same time. They'll die. So for them to upskill their competency and innovation and technology investment.
Okay, thank you, all of you. I think all of you have been very, I found fascinating hour. Thank you for sharing your insights, for being so generous with your time. I hope our attendees have also, appreciated all the sharing. There will be a recording of this webinar sent across all of you who have registered. I think we'll have more than 300 in the end that's registered, so that's really great. ZICO hopes to bring more of these business leaders webinars to you. So please join in. We're every Wednesday around this time. And the next one, I think we'll send you an email on the next one. But thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.